Hi, welcome back to my channel, and today the video essay is my dissertation that I got an 82% on, and it's specifically on Congolese Rumba. And Congolese Rumba in Zaire, you're looking at the genre as a place of power and resistance against the dictatorship regime of Mobutu Sese Seko. So yeah, I studied philosophy, politics, and economics, and I decided to do a politics dissertation because because why not? Why not politics? And yeah, I'm Congolese. Um, I've heard a lot of stories about the regime. Congolese Rumba is such a big part of Congolese culture, so it just felt like the perfect thing to do. So I first want to start off the essay with talking about three, I guess, books that I recommend that I really enjoyed when doing the dissertation. These books, I would say, are quite positive and still insightful and unique, and it shines a light on really cool parts of Congolese history. The first one was Rumba Rules, The Politics of Dance Music in Mobutu Zaire, and that was by Bob White. And it's a whole book highlighting a lot of what I wanted to explore in this dissertation, which looks at the relationship between music, politics, and society at the time during Mobutu's regime, and it has like extracts and interviews from Congolese artists, people who listen to the music, because the author actually spent time in Congo and asked a lot of people their opinions and the history of Congolese rumba as well. The second book was Beyond the Storm, Treating the Powerless and the Powerful in Mobutu's Congo/Zaire, and that's by William Close and Michael Miatudila. And personally, I think this one is my favorite book because it has nothing to do with music, but it's just a really detailed and personal like biography from this man from the US who helped with the medical with healthcare basically in Congo, and he was Mobutu's personal like doctor at a point in the regime as well. And the author just provides a really good insight into Mobutu, into his character, and specifically into a bit of like Mobutu's positives as well. If someone would like to say that there was positives, I feel like the book covers that. The third book, which was a short book, but it was a good read, Zaire 74, The Rise and Fall of Mobutu's Leopards by, I forgot the first name, but by Andrews. And basically it's another detailed account, but specifically focusing on the national football team. That book focuses on basically the team reaching the 1974 World Cup and obviously the impact that had on society, specifically in Congo as well, because they were the first sub-Saharan African team to reach the World Cup finals, I think, or qualify. I'll double check that. But them being the first to do that, and also providing an insight into how Mobutu kind of used the team for his own propaganda, for his own regime, and yeah, provides an insight into that. Each book really helps to conceptualize Mobutu's regime and also conceptualize how Mobutu was as a dictator and how that impacted different parts of Congolese/Zairean society. I like to obviously understand Congolese Rumba at the time of Zaire. It's important to obviously have some context about the dictatorship regime. So the dictatorship regime was led by Mobutu Sese Seko, and he ascended into power through a military coup in 1965, and he overthrew the presidency of President Joseph Kasavubu, and his regime, the way I describe it in the dissertation anyway, can be simplified into three sections of cultural, economic, and radicalization. So cultural can be understood as the cultural policy of authenticity, where it was basically Mobutu being really passionate about Congolese people or Zairean people being really proud to be from Zaire. So it was basically restoring national identity, restoring pride, and feeling proud of your culture and your country. And some of the ways that he done this was replacing colonial names of cities. So the capital, Leopoldville, was changed to Kinshasa. Obviously, he changed the name of the country to Zaire. He changed the flag. There was a new national anthem. Another one of his policies was substituting Christian names with authentic African names. There was even policies to do with how people were to dress in order to stop dressing less Western. In terms of economic, that can be understood as Zaireanization, where it was basically part of a broader African trend towards nationalizing the commercial sector within your country. So that includes things like radio, media, transport, airlines. The radicalization can be understood as Mobutu's kind of kleptocratic nature of having so much control over the infrastructure of the country that allowed him to take a lot of wealth for himself, for his family, for his network, and leaving basically other people in the country to also to not reap the benefits of that. And those three policies kind of help understand how the genre rose and became and entered its golden era, and also became a site of power for Mobutu and resistance for musicians who were speaking out against, or not speaking out, or speaking on the injustices, or speaking on society at the time. So Mobutu's cultural policy, I think that can be really left up to debate in terms of how positive or negative that was for people who lived in society at the time. Economically, it is understood that obviously his regime was very corrupt, and he didn't leave the country in a better state than when he found it. By the 1980s, 70% of Zaire's population lived in absolute poverty, whilst Mobutu's assets peaked at $4 billion US. And it was also very known of his tactics to deal with resistance, such as assassinations, such as isolating political leaders, kind of looking out for any opposition, exile, torture. That was a very known tactic of his regime. Having context on the regime, it's also important to have context on the genre. And just like other genres, I feel like it's hard to discuss music in such a way when sometimes really you just need to be there. You just need to be there to see the genre, see people dance, see people sing, and understand how much of a rich and amazing genre it is, and how much and how amazing the artists are. But historically, we understand it to have started / emerged in the DRC and also Congo Brazzaville. And it was inspired by traditional Congolese music, Afro-Cuban rhythms, and also Western genres such as jazz. And you can identify it with the electric guitar arrangements, with percussion instruments, call and response vocals, when you hear like certain singers alternating phrases and lines and the audience are engaging back. The Sukus dance style as well, you can recognize that with like dance sections for people to participate, the dance routines. I feel like anyone that knows Congolese people know, listen, there's a dance routine somewhere. You go to a Congolese party, there's a dance routine happening somewhere. Like, I think once you listen to Congolese Rumba, it's very easy to identify it. You can go out and you might not know the singer, you might not know the name of the song, but when you hear that guitar, when you hear the way they're singing, you said, I know what that is. I know what you are. Really, it's a genre that's really rich in history as well. And you know that it's even rich in history. Not that the validation is needed, but the UN has even recognized it as like a cultural heritage site in itself. Like the genre, the evolution of the genre, and the rich cultural history that it has. They said, yeah. So some of the early artists that are mentioned in the book, we have Le Grand Calais, Wendo Kolosoy, I'm not sure if I said his name right. And then with some modern artists, we have people like Papa Wemba, Fally Ipupa, Zaiko. And then in terms of at the time of Mobutu's regime, we have people like Franco, Tabule, I'm going to stick with Tabule, OK Jazz, Afrisa. So yeah, there's so many amazing artists who have come from that genre. And the genre itself, it's very much understood to be a really key part of Congolese identity, and it was a key part of people's social lives at the time as well. And that is also emphasized by that's just a testament to how much Congolese Rumba was a part of national identity. Like that was the anthem of declaring independence from the Belgians. Like it was like a symbolization of pride. And the 1970s is kind of known as the genre's golden age because it was global, it was mass produced, it was mass consumed. Like throughout the African continent, like that was one of the biggest genres coming out of the African continent, never mind throughout the continent, because artists were traveling all around the world. People wanted to hear some Congolese Rumba. You just had to be there to really understand. Genre discusses basically everything. Like you can hear everything in Congolese Rumba song. It's talking about family, it's talking about love, it's talking about money, it's talking about just the struggles of life. And I guess similarly to a lot of genres, when you're discussing things that are either lighthearted or there's no explicit mention of politics, there's an assumption that it can't be political, when I feel like we're definitely coming to an understanding that music is very much so political, especially with Congolese Rumba, because it represents literally national identity, especially at the time of the regime. So it actually makes it an ideal place for political engagement to happen, as well as resistance and expression. And I kind of emphasize that in my dissertation, using the quote from Street, where he says that politics can illuminate an understanding of popular music, and popular music can illuminate politics. So it's that understanding that the two basically go hand in hand. Specifically with Mobutu, he invested a lot into the music recording industry during his regime, which allowed it to flourish, and it allowed artists to produce really good music and reach global audiences. However, you can literally see his political instability, the economic hardships that occurred. It really did impact the lives of these artists as well as the industry. And you can see that with what is known as the exodus of artists out of Kinshasa into other places in the West, such as Paris, Brussels, London. And it didn't completely stop the cultural production, but it definitely did disrupt it. Opening the boundaries of what is political, what can we see as political, we can definitely see music as a time capsule. It can give insight into what do people care about, what are people listening to, why are they listening to it, why are artists talking about this. And because music has such a big influence on our emotions, on our moods, and it's in so many different parts of our lives, it's definitely a way for people to communicate things that can inspire action, and it allows it to also start conversations because it can communicate a lot of messages. So when researching for my dissertation and researching popular culture and politics, popular music and politics, you can tend to find that a lot of the mainstream information and the examples are focused on the West. But there was a lot of rich information on looking at the capacity of music, specifically African music and politics. And there was loads of articles and different papers that spoke about how in African culture, music is so powerful. Act of singing in itself is such a key part of so many human experiences on the continent, especially considering that so many different cultures had oral traditions that were handed down. And these lyrics and the music is literally carrying messages sometimes from way back. And music making is literally a part of African culture from birth till death. So because music is such a powerful medium on the continent for expressing so many different things, it's no wonder that the music that came out of the continent on the time, not just Congo, that came out of the continent at the time, that was some powerful stuff. It wasn't just Congolese rumba at the time, but that's why we have people like Fela Kuti. That's why we have people like Miriam Makeba. There's levels to this. There's a unique aspect to it. And across the continent, there's basically loads of different examples of musicians engaging with issues of social justice, democracy, and liberation. In my reading, I found things from Tanzania, South Africa, Cape Verde, Sudan, Guinea, Malawi, and also just acknowledging even outside the continent within Latin America, but also the Black diaspora in America with basically the whole genre of hip hop and rap. So it's kind of that understanding that music can provoke such a strong feeling, especially when it's such a key part of your culture. It makes it the ideal place for power and resistance to operate. And African leaders were and are very aware of this power, because it resulted in music also being used as a political weapon to strengthen regimes, propagate ideologies, which is why a lot of military coups were quick to seize control of radio stations. There's a part in the paper which looks at the political economy of Congolese Rumba and Zaire, where it looks at how the three different parts of Mobutu's regime impacted the music industry. So Zaireanization, it kind of had a negative impact on the music industry because it led to challenges. Nationalization led to challenges in accessing raw materials for record production, which hindered a lot of ways to basically produce music and distribute music. With authenticity, obviously the main goal was to sustain national identity and create support for the regime. And this kind of led to a political economy of music. And it created a state-minded praise music culture. So what that is basically politicians getting musicians to sing their praises. This obviously wasn't done for free. Musicians would get paid to do it. So it was a way for musicians to also attain social mobility, but it was mainly done to to boost the regime, a form of propaganda as well. And this isn't something, I feel like for people that are familiar with Congolese Rumba, it's definitely something you can be familiar with. Sometimes it's also known as libanga, where musicians sing the names of influential figures, and at the time often politicians, for money. And you can hear that in certain songs where sometimes in the middle of the dance break, just at the end of the song, it's just a list of names. They got paid for that. Some artists were forced into the arrangement regarding politicians, and others willingly engaged. Either way, I think in general, it shows how the genre definitely became a place of power for politicians, because it was a place to almost maintain social order and to make sure that everyone in the country was on the same vibe. One thing to point out is that Mobutu was very intentional with these actions, and he even says it. There's a quote from one of his speeches where he says, "The best way to achieve happiness is it not through one's culture." He saw how using culture was a great way to gather support for his regime. So because he was so passionate about cultural heritage and tradition, he used the genre to shape the cultural landscape of what he wanted. And an example of this is emphasizing the value of Salongo. For people that don't know what Salongo is, it means community work in Lingala. And it was even one of his policies was that everyone needs to do Salongo on a Saturday. You need to do something for your community, whether that be clean the street, build a well, help somebody, help your community. That was one of the things that Mobutu was really passionate about. And you can find like Tabule, again, one of the biggest Congolese Rumba artists. He even performed 2 songs called Salongo in one of the biggest festival that happened in Zaire in 1974. It had artists such as James Brown, Miriam Makeba. It was a big festival, and literally in that festival, Tabule is talking about Salongo, emphasizing the value, encouraging people to do Salongo. And he also, in that same festival, he had Congolese artists also singing praise songs to him. There's literally a song by Abeti Masekini in 1974, and it's titled the Mobutu Praise Song. And what she's saying is translated to, "Who built this, Zaire, everyone? Mobutu the father built this. Emperor, our father. Mother Mobutu, our mother." And Mother Mobutu being Mobutu's wife. So we can see that there's just many examples that Mobutu knew. The regime knew the power of the genre, and it became just an ideal place literally for political engagement. In my paper, I chose 4 different Congolese Rumba songs, 2 that show examples of power and 2 that show examples of resistance. And I basically used textual analysis to infer meanings as to what those songs could mean, because some of them aren't as implicit as the rest. And basically by doing this is obviously reading up on the lived experiences of people who lived in Zaire, so which is why I read all those different books and more, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. The first song is République du Zaire by Kwame Franco and OK Jazz, which came out in 1970. The second song is Candidat na Biso Mobutu by Franco and OK Jazz, which came out in 1984. The third song is Nyama ya Nzamba by Dewayon and Orchestra Gobantu, which came out in 1994. And the final song is Lukoki by Franco, which came out in 1988. So République du Zaire is basically a power song because throughout the lyrics we see strong stances of power and authority of the political regime. And it was created 5 years into the dictatorship and sung by OK Jazz. And OK Jazz were one of the leading schools of Congolese Rumba at the time, and they played in concerts all over Africa, such as Chad and Sudan. So in the song, they talk about Tongo etani bandeko, moi ebimi, butu eindi bandeko, ika mobutu akanisa ninyo, makambo bakoko batika, Tongo etani bandeko. Key to acknowledge that in Congolese society at the time, belief and respect of elders, regardless of religious practice, is very key. And that line is mentioned 4 times throughout. The song. So I think, referencing ancestors is very intentional because it basically shows that the same belief and respect that you have in elders, you should also have that for Mobutu. Oh, bandeko, Mobutu mokanisi. Oh, bandeko, Mobutu mobongisi. And this contributes to Mobutu's savior complex. And we can see Mobutu's savior complex in other parts of society, because in different parts of media, at the beginning and end of every national television stream, there was a video of Mobutu's head descending from the clouds. And that was mentioned in the Rumba Rules book as well. And it contributes to this messiah narrative that Mobutu had, where he wanted to propose himself as the savior of Zaire, of the savior of Congo. And this also is seen in Mobutu's tense relationship with the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church had such a big influence in Congo, especially regarding education. There was a clash between Christian ideology and the ideology of authenticity. Especially when Mobutu was mentioning a lot of rejecting Western ideals, Western forms of dressing, Western forms of thinking. And one of these examples is shown as how in 1974, the government ordered for all religious symbols to be removed from public buildings, and Christmas was removed from the national calendar. So we can see how Mobutu wanted to replace the belief that Congolese people had, whether in God or in Jesus, in basically to him. The end of the song basically mentions how is talking about different parts of Zaire, like let's say the river returns to the name of Zaire, and at the end it says, let's change the flag, let's change the national anthem. So I think this song is very clear and explicit into what is being declared and what is trying to be encouraged. It's gathering support for authenticity, it's trying to build national unity, it's trying to restore pride. When Mobutu came into power, there was loads of ethnic tensions, specifically in the Katanga province in the eastern region, where they declared independence shortly after the country declared independence, because the Concat party believed that the wealth of the Katanga province should only benefit those in Katanga, due to the region being really rich in natural resources. So things like the ethnic tensions in themselves kind of show why Mobutu wanted to build national unity. He wanted everyone to be Zairean. The next power song is Candida na Biso Mobutu by Franco and OK Jazz. Now, this song specifically is 20 minutes, and it's a 20-minute song celebrating Mobutu as the savior of the nation. Now, for a bit of context as to Franco and OK Jazz, again, OK Jazz being one of the biggest schools of Congolese Rumba at the time, and Franco specifically, he was one of the biggest Congolese Rumba artists. He was known throughout the continent. He received like the French equivalent of a Grammy in Paris. He was the third African musician ever to do so. He was a professional musician for over 30 years, and he received the National Order of the Leopards, which is one of Zaire's highest honors, to basically recognize. Mobutu recognized Franco's importance to the country's cultural life. And additionally, Franco at that time also had a public friendship with Mobutu, and Mobutu also appointed him to be the president of the National Federation of Artists, where Franco also had complete control over the country's musicians. So that kind of context also provides insight into the people that are singing and their motivations also to be singing what they're singing. So as well as obviously reaching out to people of different religious beliefs to kind of again emphasize unity and see him as their savior, the referencing of sorcerers are still there. It references basically to the resistance that Mobutu faced. It's important to recognize that during Mobutu's rule, citizens indefinitely showed resistance throughout his 32-year rule. And this can be via protests or other politicians trying to overthrow him. And this was responded to with extreme discipline, whether it be prison, exile, or death. This song, Candide Nabiso Mabusu, came out in 1984. And in 1978, Mobutu sent armed forces to rural cities, Idiofa and Mulembe. And in that, the people that he sent slaughtered many civilians. In 1980, 13 Zairean senators wrote a letter to Mobutu, and they were suggesting a national forum, and they were all sentenced to 15 years in prison and tortured. And one of them, Makanda Binga, was executed. And these executions and these violent acts that Mobutu was doing, he justified these executions on television. It wasn't something that was almost kept a secret. It was quite known that this was something that Mobutu and his government did. And he explained that his executions, even executions where he's hung people in public in front of civilians, he explained that this was a warning. This was a warning to individuals, and it was done to protect national peace and unity in the country. And that is who the sorcerers are in the song. When referencing the sorcerers, it's referencing basically people who are trying to go against Mobutu, and almost referencing the fate of those people as well. And this is also contributed with the prevalence of spies within the country who would inform the government on anyone who was conspiring or wasn't obliging to Mobutu's policies. So it was basically very clear that Mobutu's regime had a lot of power in the daily lives of citizens, and this is warned in the music being released at the time. And these spies were also known to operate in schools as well for anyone who didn't oblige to certain cultural policies, such as singing and dancing to Mobutu praise songs.
Exaïx sosa comme sonas esne régideso Ralima uniba espeka midema agetaf Ozakaf la voix du Zaïre Asaf Elima Salongo Candidat nabiso Mobutu Afriza Okejas Nazaiko Candidat nabiso Mobutu.
Listing the companies that Mobutu nationalized for the country in order to seek economic autonomy. And Mobutu has said separately in another speech that the Congo can no longer feed or clothe its own sons. Therefore, citizens need to roll up their sleeves and work. So Mobutu was very passionate about economic autonomy, about Congolese people being the producers, basically. And a lot of these companies that are mentioned is their mining companies, property, electricity, alcohol, coffee, and transport. So that explicit reference to Zaireanization is an explicit reference to Mobutu's policies, again demonstrating power. Later on, the lyrics also include famous artists from the genre pledging allegiance to the regime, such as Afrisa, OK Jazz, and Zaiko. Now, for reference, Afrisa was one of the most successful bands in Africa and was led by Taboulé. And Taboulé produced over 200 albums and composed up to 3,000 songs during his time as a musician. Zaiko was known to have a really big following, especially amongst teenagers, because they created new dances and they influenced millions of people across the country. And OK Jazz were also known to identify well with lower class citizens of the country. So having all these different artists pledging allegiance to, imagine your favorite artist pledging allegiance to basically a certain politician. The first resistance song, Nyamayanzamba, it was released by Dewayon, who was the mentor of Franco, released in 1994, and this is 3 years before the end of the regime. So for context, at this time, Zaire was going through a lot. The country was tackling inflation and poverty, and this was due to Mobutu's greed and corruption. So at first, when you look at that kind of metaphorical nature, it can seem that the song is unpolitical or it's unworthy of academic attention due to its discussion on wild animals and things that someone might not understand after listening to it for the first time. But considering that citizens, like I mentioned, risked prison or death speaking out against the regime, it makes sense that resistance songs can be extremely implicit. Now, with the research that I've done, I found that obviously with a lot of indigenous Congolese practices, proverbs and metaphors were used to articulate a lot of messages with deeper meanings and are rarely communicated for someone to simply interpret that on a surface level. It is communicated with the intention and with the expectation that someone is going to read deeply into this. They're not just used in a light way, but it's also used to teach people, reprimand people, punish people, and also to heal people. And in proverbs, animals are often used as a symbol of humans. So therefore, a wild animal can actually be understood to be a human. And it's just a matter of interpreting specifically what human are we talking about here. And at the time, a wild animal can also be understood to be a bushman. And a bushman was a term often used to describe people born in the Equatorial Province. And the Equatorial Province is where Mobutu was born. And this is basically this can be interpreted as a reference to Mobutu's untraditional upbringing, quote unquote, untraditional upbringing. So later on in the song, Dewayon says, Mama botanga lobaka na ngai mwana ndimaka pe pasi ya mokili Tata botanga elongi kotuna ebite Kaka se masolo ya bakulutu To my mum who birthed me and tells me, and later on talks about my father gave me a face that I don't know. So again, for context, this is something that I found in the book by William Close, and it's very interesting that the book was able to provide context into Mobutu's personal life. And in the book, it talks about how Mobutu's mother was a femme libre, and a femme libre is a free woman. And basically, this was known as a single woman who left their village in Congo, but they left without a husband. And these women were required by colonial health services to go through monthly medical examinations for sexually transmitted diseases. And Mobutu's mother, it was known that apparently moved to various cities such as Lisala, Businga, and N'Djamena, where she had children, but she didn't get married. And as a result of this, Mobutu unfortunately never knew the name of his biological father. And in the book, it references how, or William Close referenced how this caused a certain insecurity, and it was something that many people were aware of. Talking about, the pain, Kwame said, pain of this world. And these lyrics can be a form of expression of how it felt to live in Zaire at the time of an economic crisis. Because like I mentioned, this was 3 years before the end of the regime where Mobutu's corruption and greed was at an all-time high. So per capita income declined at an annual rate of 2.2% from 1965 to 1990. Zaireanization was clearly a fail due to the majority of the assets being poorly managed. And in 1991, there was so many violent unrests in autumn as civilians and armed forces began to riot to demand higher and more reliable wages. So we can see at the time that the political instability and environment at the time and the tension in society due to political neglect, this can manifest into music, into what people are talking about. The record industry was left wounded, and a lot of musicians either had to leave Zaire or they ended up struggling because the state couldn't guarantee their livelihood anymore in comparison to at the beginning of the regime. The last song is Lukoki by Franco, and this song is not sung in Lingala like the other songs. It is sung in Kikongo, and Kikongo is a language native to the Bakongo people in west of Zaire, west of the DRC. And it's interesting how Franco comes up again, because the last time I was talking about Franco is him singing a 20-minute song about how great Mobutu is as a politician. And this is one of the last songs before Franco passed away. And I think the fact that it's Franco, it highlights how the genre can operate in two spaces at once, how the genre can be a space of power and of resistance, especially when we look across time. And Franco has been imprisoned and disciplined before for his lyrics. So it's not surprising that if he was to speak out in a song of resistance, it manifests in a proverbial nature and in his native tongue. So again, this song is proverbial and metaphorical. So in order to understand what is being said, you would have to go further to interpret it. So in Kikongo, there is an expression called Zonzila Mubingana, and this means talk in proverbial language. And this is used basically in communities to prevent the leaking of secrecies. So it's basically talking in proverbs so that the people that you don't want to know, don't know. Does that make sense? So obviously, the people that you don't want to know, Mobutu is not part of the Bakongo people. He can't speak Kikongo, he can't understand Kikongo, or maybe he did, I don't know. But either way, it can be assumed that singing in Kikongo as well can highlight how implicit the resistance needed to be. So it's also understood that the song Lukoki is based on folklore and is also similar to the Chimurenga music of Zimbabwe. And Chimurenga was a subgenre of popular music in Zimbabwe, and it developed in the 1960s as a form of cultural resistance, protesting government rule. So kind of using the fact that the song is slightly inspired by a genre of resistance, and also the fact that the song is sung in a proverbial nature and is based on folklore, we can understand this song to be a song of resistance. So the song in general is a warning to an individual called Lukoki, and we can understand that the individual Lukoki is Mobutu, especially when looking at the repetition of the word chief, who is clearly someone of leadership.
Ana Lukoki, pasinkene wakunde. Minchamu nadamu chimfiafi mungo manisanga. Keba. Utakwenda kutanimani makwe. Kwenda ni kwenda yaya.
So the term saltfish is used to describe Lukoki's greed. So instead of Lukoki sharing the fish with his community, instead he keeps it under his armpit out of selfishness. So this explains how Lukoki really isn't thinking of people that don't get to eat. They're not thinking of, they're kind of going against the traditional Congolese value where individuals should always be looking out for their community, ensuring that everyone has wealth, not just keeping all the wealth for yourself. And we can see a version of that kind of value in Mobutu's kleptocratic behavior, because many of the people who were rewarded assets, especially during Zaireanization when everything was being nationalized, were his family members, such as Mobutu gifting his uncle the biggest grocery store in Kinshasa. But of course, not everyone got to experience this. This was only within Mobutu's circle, not actually the country. Especially when you're a chief, when you're a leader, your responsibility is making sure that everyone gets to have wealth, that everyone is in a comfortable place. Then hearing this part of the song and then also researching Mobutu's regime, this can really be applied to Mobutu, because it's actually important to acknowledge that during Mobutu's regime, there was definitely positive results from his investments in parts of the country. And one of those positive results is definitely healthcare. And again, the book that I read from William Close, looking at how successful healthcare was in Congo during a certain time, I think it's definitely a testament to the amount of investment that was given into healthcare in Congo. From 1968, Hôpital Mama Yemo, which was named after Mobutu's mother, it was known as one of the best hospitals in the African continent, and it delivered care for people from over 25 countries and from across the whole country. And by 1972, the hospital had leading health technology and saw over 4,000 patients a day. So I think that's definitely a testament to where Franco says, anyway, Lukoki is sometimes a good boy. He does a good job when he's asked to. But anytime he smells or sees the salted fish, before you know it, he's gone. And I think, again, you can see that trend with the hospital, because by the 1990s, the hospital was struggling to pay for staff for months, and it ended up relying on limited resources to serve the population. So ultimately, Lukoki/Mobutu's greed took over. And the last thing I kind of explained to confirm that Lukoki is definitely Mobutu is just by simply understanding how Mobutu and Franco were definitely in close proximity to each other, because it was understood that both of them respected and listened to each other, which is why at the beginning of his regime, Mobutu used Franco as propaganda and rewarded him very generously. And people viewed Franco as someone to learn from. They really identified with his upbringing and his preference for singing in Lingala rather than French, and this united his audience. And when it's understood that their relationship obviously didn't stay positive and they grew distant, I think it's fair to assume that Lukoki is Mobutu. Especially at the time when Lukoki was released, Franco was one of the many Congolese musicians who participated in the exodus and went to the West. And his last few years, he was spent traveling between Paris and Kinshasa. So it's said when looking at like historical writings about the time, Franco went from one of the musicians who praised the regime the most to one of the most passionate musicians who complained about the regime. And he wrapped these complaints in rumba. He wrapped these complaints in music. He hid these complaints because in fear of silencing, marginalization, imprisonment, etc. And actually, the last thing to say, which I really feel like this seals the deal myself. Franco has explained that his songwriting approach demands critical thinking. He explained that the listener has to interpret the music correctly. He further explains that the song is only half composed, so the listener has to take responsibility for the rest of the composition and add meaning. So when you take Franco's personal relations with Mobutu and basically his demand that people think critically about his lyrics, and then as we do, I feel like I've critically thought about the lyrics and tried to interpret the proverb in the song, we can conclude that Lukoki is definitely a song used to exert resistance against the political regime. So to wrap up, this paper was really interesting to see the contrast of power and resistance in the songs and to demonstrate the different ways in which music reflected the political culture, and seeing the use of spirituality, understanding what authenticity meant at the time, seeing the failure and successes of Zaireanization. The dissertation kind of shows that as the strong emotional impact that music has on people's lives means that it can have such a strong significance in the political sphere. And when we broaden our understanding of what is the political, we can see ways that popular culture and politics are ultimately just a reflection of each other. I also say that to recognize that because the genre was heavily influenced by the dictatorship at the time, it doesn't mean that the genre was just solely there to praise the state. And it also doesn't mean that the genre was solely there to speak out against the state. It simply means that the genre allowed people to use their musical abilities to express, to demonstrate, to express and to demonstrate their emotions and to demonstrate their thoughts and reflect the time. So it's just important to understand the genre on just this amazing spectrum where so many things can occur and happen. And they all happen together and at once and at the same time. So yeah, I'm really happy that this paper kind of contributes to the understanding of popular culture in Africa and its role in politics. And it also adds to the understanding of how multifaceted countries are, especially in terms of history. It's not just a violent past and present of conflict and war and poverty, but it's also a past and present of innovation, of culture, of joy, and it's rich and it's beautiful. So the paper kind of aims to offer that perspective on how a vibrant genre can reveal kind of complex aspects of a country. So yeah, I'm happy that I did that and did that for the Anglophones as well, because as an academic researching Congolese culture, it being a Francophone country means that you're sitting there reading academia in French, and sometimes that's hard. So I hope that this paper and this video can kind of allow more people to engage with Congolese culture and Congolese history.